But somehow it got under some piles of my paper. So would you kindly read your seizures? Please come out here.
Where are you from?
Oh, I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I teach at first grade at Carpentry Elementary. This is untitled, but I think you might understand this. Tick, tock, tick. Keep the time to learn all about Korean life. Fun, food, art, and history about culture of Korea. Questions, thoughts are allowed, but you have 5 minutes to return.
Because of my mistake, I'm presenting two gifts. Shijogo, and this book is written by Yuni Hong about the birth of Korean cool. So can we have a picture? One announcement. If you want the Korean alphabet sticker, I have few left.
Okay, next announcement. So we'll have cakes cut up for you, and we'll have it in the lobby for later. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Maybe we'll have Lucy go on stage and take it, and everyone else. 네, 무대 위에서 찍어주세요. 저희 다 나오게. 무대 위에서 찍으셔야지 나옵니다. Alright, we'll turn around. Everyone else in the photo. Okay. Thank you. This has been a wonderful. I've just been celebrating all week.
So the cake will be ready at the lobby during intermission, so you can come out later and taste it.
Alright, finally, today's first lecture, I will introduce the first presenter, Dr. Edward Park. Is a professor of Asian and Asian American Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California. He received his PhD in Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. His current research topics include migration studies, race relations, urban studies, and economic sociology. His most recent publications examine the transformation of Koreatown since the Los Angeles civil unrest of 1992, migration policies in the U.S., and the East Asia, and the role of transnational linkages in the career opportunities of Korean American scientists and engineers.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let's see. Like all professors, I think I have a little bit of a performer in me. And And the big lesson is never follow a birthday party. I think I still see the candle smoke. I'm going to just bring some bummer news, history of Korean Americans, in fact, contains a lot of horrible things. And I just feel like I'm killing the mood on the floor. And so, as was introduced, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm a professor at Loyola Marymount University. Despite my youthful looks, I've been teaching for about 25 years now, primarily on issues related to Asian Americans, Korean Americans, U.S. and Korea relations. And I really hope one of the great things about this event is that I get to exchange emails and with the teachers who are, who've been engaged with Korean issues for a whole week, and then they take this back to their classrooms, and it's just been a great pleasure to serve as like a resource person for all the folks who participate. So my email address is pretty obvious there with my name. I also have a website that contains some of the publications that were mentioned. And if you want to do any deep dive on some of these issues, you're more than welcome to hop onto them. I have, I guess you guys have a very big important business at 9:30, and so a little less than an hour. So we'll make through this pretty quickly. My understanding is you guys, all of you have the slides, lecture slides with you, and so I think there's no need to write things down. And at the end, what I'll do is try my best to preserve 15 minutes or so for any questions or discussion points you want to raise, and so we could have some exchange. So, as you know so well now, Korea is one of my favorite phrases that describe Korea, right? I'm sure you guys heard of the term like the hermit kingdom, right? Explaining the long isolation. My favorite descriptor is a little more dramatic, and the dramatic description is the description of shrimp among the waves, right? And as someone who's maybe 5'6" on a good day, I kind of relate to the idea. Nobody thought that was funny. One of the evaluations is you have to. All right. Geographers love to say that geography is destiny, and your mileage may vary on that phrase, but perhaps Korea, more than some other places in the world, is a great big example of that. And so why is this important? Well, it's important because the Korean American experience begins at the most consequential moment in our global history, and that is from 1500 onwards, European countries began sailing across the oceans and began colonizing, exercising imperial power over the world. Right? And much like the Chinese American and Japanese American compatriots who also made the trans-Pacific migration to the United States, Korean journey to the U.S. begins with this era of gunboat diplomacy, right? And for Korea, it will become perhaps more dramatic than any other country in East Asia. On the geography alone, what you see is Korea is surrounded by three of the most powerful nations and civilizations in the world. It shares a land border with China, a country that Korea has always seen as something like an older brother, right? Where Korean culture and language, especially high culture and language, come from. Just the straits across the Korean Straits is Japan. And Japan, once again, I'm sure you got a whole week of this, a very, very powerful country, country that invaded Korea on occasions as a way to try and solve its own internal crisis of power. And during this era of gunboat diplomacy that comes to East Asia in the early 1800s, Japan has decided that it's not going to resist the Americans nor the Europeans, but it will join them, right? And so, as China famously tried to fight the British through 2 opium wars and lost the control of its country, Japan decides it's not going to follow China's footsteps. Instead, it will modernize. It would build an army and a navy. And it will become an imperialist themselves. And it would look to Korea as the land bridge to Asian landmass, right? And then Korea is also shares a land border with Russia, which would then become Soviet Union and would become Russia again, right? But Russia would also play a very, very important role. You see North Korea as a satellite state of Soviet Union, and that drama continues to this day. All of that to say that is that the sort of poor Korea looks like a rabbit, you know, with the funny ears, a sitting rabbit, and it's surrounded by these 3 countries that's got some ill designs over its fate. The other point that I want to make is that when Korea enters this world history, right, the world history of gunboat diplomacy, right, stitching together the world as a singular whole, it happens really late. It happens in the mid-1800s. And by that time, there's a country across the Pacific Ocean that at one time was a colony of Britain, but became a nation and went from sea to shining sea. And it is no other country than the United States itself, right, that opens up Japan with Commodore Perry, comes to Korea, and is an essential player in that drama. So it's a very interesting idea, right? Korea has to negotiate between 4 different countries, and it's fighting for its existential sort of survival, right? With all the nuclear talk between North Korea, you know, I think a lot of Koreans were reminded that once again, right? That is, boy, the fate of Korea lies with countries like the United States, China, Putin, Russia, and so on, right? So that's the idea. All right. Talked about the gunboat diplomacy, you know, whether it's the British clippers trading opium in China, or Matthew Commodore Perry opening up Japan on behalf of the United States. Korean-American story begins with this era of imperialism and colonization. Now, it is in fact Japan that opens up Korea to the world, right? And that is an interesting idea once again. And so, unlike China, that views Britain as this sort of enemy that wrestled itself out of its long slumber, or with Japan, right, who have also a complicated relationship with the United States, right, as it was forced to open up, right? In fact, Japan and the United States would fight a world war. The U.S. will drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan. And so in other words, this sort of course that Japan takes ends in tragedy for the world and for Japan itself, right? But as Japan decides, as Japan decides in 1850 that it will join the West, it only takes 24 years before they sail into Korea and say, we demand a treaty so that you are forced to receive Japanese trading ships, you're forced to trade let Japanese own land in Korea, and allow Koreans to migrate to Japan and allow Japanese to migrate to Korea, right? And so this is the classic European unequal treaty, but this time it's Japan that foists it on Korea, right? This will have sort of interesting consequences later on. 7 years later, United States comes to Korea and also demands this kind of treaty, and American companies, race to Korea and build Korea's railroad, telegraph system. They end up running some of the country's biggest mines, and all these Christian missionaries, right, come to Korea to convert souls in this hermit kingdom. Now, the long story is that Japan's design on Korea is not just trade, but military conquest and political domination. And later on, a very wild idea, but later on it would become cultural assimilation. What the hell does that mean? Well, we'll find out, right? So, one thing that Korea does as they face this problem with Japan is they invite all the other powers to its capital, allow the Chinese and Russians to have military presence in Korea to try and check the aggression of the Japanese. This would result in 2 wars that will impact not only East Asia but the world, right? And that is the Sino-Japanese War, where Japan fights its elder brother China and defeats them. And so the Chinese are driven out of Korea. Russo-Japanese War is fought. The Japanese become victorious, and Russians are chased out of Korea. Japan also ends up with Taiwan as a colony. Also, Port MacArthur is part of Japanese territory, right? Japan's expansion grows through these wars over who controls Korea. And Japan becomes a global rising power, right? Eventually, what's going to happen is that Korea is going to become a protectorate of Japan. What that means is that Koreans are allowed to have a measure of sovereignty for its internal affairs. But Japan will make Korea's international relations. That'll become a little important too, right? But we now see that was just the middle stage. That was so that Japan could try and gain global support for complete domination. And that domination happens with annexation in 1910. So in 1910, what does annexation mean? What it means is nothing less than there is no such a country as Korea anymore, right? Country that's existed for a very, very long time. So if you look at some of the world maps, when I was a little kid, there was still enough maps that were in the classroom that were drawn, before the 1940s that didn't have Korea on it. And this was a huge source of irritation for a lot of Korean parents, right? So they would march into the history classroom and say, hey man, you need to change these maps, right? But that's what it was, right? Later on, Koreans are forced to adopt Japanese names. That's the assimilation part. And the language of instruction in Korean schools become Japanese, right? The story becomes a little complicated because as soon as that happens, large number of Korean students studied at Tokyo Imperial University. One of these Koreans would become no less than the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Japanese government, imperial government, right? But suffices to say, Korea is literally erased, right? I think for some folks, what what you think is like, oh my God, that is just an amazing idea. That's just so out of the ordinary. But I think if you're Armenian, or if you're Polish or Irish, you're like, oh man, yeah, this is a very common chapter in global history, right? And so that's the idea, right? Now, a very important person in Korean and Korean American history is this man by the name of Horace Allen. And Horace Allen was a missionary, and he was one of these young men who was given this great liberal arts education in the Midwest, right? He knew as an American that the world was much bigger than Ohio, and he wanted to try his fortune in the world's greatest stage. So as these Americans were pouring into China, right? He went to China to try and practice medicine, start businesses, convert, Chinese into Christianity. He eventually failed in his Chinese effort and ended up in Korea. And while he was waiting for the audience with the king, one of the queens, Queen Min's nephew was ill, and he was able to successfully treat this nephew of the king. This wins him big favor with the Korean court, and he becomes an advisor. Horace Allen also, in Korea, establishes a hospital, Western Hospital, Severance Hospital, at Yonsei University. You could still see that hospital. You could see his statue all over. Now, he has a very interesting advice, and that is, let's just say, he had a casual conversation. He says, hey, king, Korea is going to be no more. Japan is going to gobble you up. And only way Korea would exist is if Koreans escape Korea itself. A wild idea, right? So in Korea, Koreans can no longer be Koreans. So the way you fight this is to send Koreans abroad so that they will remember and fight for Korea's reestablishment. It's like a ghost that needs to be conjured up, right? And so that's exactly what happens. He advises the king also that America is going to be a global power. America was a colony. America believes in overthrowing imperialism. So you should send Koreans to the United States. And so the king agrees and begins a policy of immigration where Koreans are sent. Later on, we also found out that Horace Allen was receiving some commission from the plantation owners of Hawaii and the farmers of California to send Koreans to work in these plantations. Whatever, right? But like so many things, right? Ideal political positions sometimes reflect crass economic concern. All right. One other thing that happens is that Japan, once they gain Korea's foreign policy, what's the first thing they do? They stop Korean immigration to the United States, right? Why? Because indeed, the first thing Koreans do when they go abroad is start agitating for Korea's independence. They'll talk about Korea's struggle with anybody who's willing to listen. On a serious note, in San Francisco, a group of Koreans assassinated a man by the name of Durham Stevens, who the Japanese installed as a puppet foreign affairs minister for the Korean government, whose job was to convince Americans that Koreans were uncivilized and that they would benefit from Japan's imperialism. He was shot outside the ferry building in San Francisco. Okay. All right, so after the Japanese exclusion order of 1905, about 8,000 Koreans are in the mainland and in Hawaii. This tiny group of people, though, will have an outsized influence on Korean affairs. How outsized? Well, so outsized that one of the people would become the president of South Korea itself. So the very first South Korean president is a guy by the name of Sungman Rhee, who came to the United States at a young age. He was in his early 20s. Lived in the United States for well over 30, 40 years. He lived in the US twice as long as he lived in Korea. He spoke Korean with an accent, and he was married to an Austrian woman. So the First Lady of Korea is not a Korean, but a woman who was Austrian. Okay. The people who are able to come to the United States are these called student exiles. So they were young men who fought this kind of independence fight in Korea. They got arrested, and then they got on a ship, and from Korea they went to Yokohama, and from Yokohama, Japan, they came to the United States, right? So man on the left is the first president of South Korea, Sungman Rhee. He came to the United States. Long story short, he got his college degree at George Washington. He got a master's at Harvard and a PhD at Princeton. And he went to Princeton because Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton at the time, and he thought that Wilson would be a good contact to have. So when your Korean parents are saying, like, why can't my kids get into Harvard and Princeton when someone could and he can even speak English, now you know what Koreans have to deal with, you know what I'm saying? Korean American kids. And it's horrible. Right? All right. Sungman Rhee wrote a dissertation at Princeton, and it was about how U.S. and Japan will fight a war, and Korea will gain its independence. Crescent, right? And Sungman Rhee, right, so let's just leave it at that. The man on the right is a man by the name of, okay, there we go. Man by the name of An Chang-ho. And An Chang-ho is a hero of Korean Americans here in Los Angeles. Sungman Rhee's advice was that as soon as Korea gains its independence, all Korean Americans go back. So his image or his idea of Korean Americans was a community of exiles, right? An Chang-ho, on the other hand, advised that for Korean Americans, for them to be successful in the world, they need to build a solid community here in America, right? And so he fought for not only this sort of preservation of Korean identity, support of Korean independence, but he also had like very early ideas of like civil rights, right? To try and find fairness in America so that Korean Americans would have better life for themselves and for their children. He also felt that there was a permanent place for Koreans in the United States itself. An Chang-ho's house is now the Center for Korean Studies Institute at USC. So you could actually go to SC, go into his house, and see how he lived. Did you have a quick question?
Yes. So Sungman Rhee, I always see it as Sungman Rhee, but not Rhee Sungman. So it's because he's American and the Koreans call him Sungman Rhee, or East?
Yeah, there are some real famous Koreans during this time who were so famous within sort of an American context. They're just known by that name, right? And whereas, maybe An Chang-ho wasn't so famous among Americans, and so we still preserve his Korean way of writing.
Is there monument or something to Mr. Cho here?
Yeah. There's a
Okay.
number of different monuments. He's like sort of the hero of Korean community, both in LA and San Francisco, where he split his time. All right. For the life of Korean Americans in the United States, they led a very modest life during this time, right? And so they did not have Koreatown with 20 banks, or they didn't live in Irvine next to Hyundai and Kia and get to go to BCD every day and, be so cool. I'm really envious, because when I was growing up in Korea, it wasn't cool to be Korean, but now it's like big break, right? All right. So they begin their life as farm workers. And one of the differences between Koreans and Chinese, for instance, is that because Japan was a rising power, they were allowed to bring wives to the United States. And typically these were picture wives. That is, they were single men when they came. They did not have the resources to go back, so they got married through the exchange of pictures. The United States government's position was that we will look at Koreans not as Koreans, but as Japanese. Because we have a treaty with Japan, and we're bound to treat Koreans as if they're Japanese nationals. One of the benefits is this picture bride system. So Koreans, unlike the Chinese, would not be condemned to a bachelor society, right? So the Chinese communities built bachelor society. These men die out. The Chinese numbers plummet, while the Koreans and Japanese numbers grow. All right. Korean Americans, the main takeaway in this slide is that the Korean Americans join African Americans and Mexican Americans in not having access to full civil rights by the virtue of their racial difference, right? What was the most decisive form of discrimination for Koreans, as well as Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, and Indians? They could not become citizens, right? And so in the United States, 1790, US passes a law that says only whites could become citizens. Other groups are able to gain citizenship, Civil War, for instance, with African Americans. Asian Americans would be the very last group to be able to become citizens in this country, right? When does that happen? 1952, right? With the passage of McCarran-Walter Act of 1952, right? It's a striking idea. It's a very striking idea. When I say 1952 to my college students, they say, "Oh my God, that's such an ancient history." Well, when I say that to a group of teachers, yeah, it's a little mixed, right? It's a very, very recent period. And it's striking to think that Asian Americans, a group that is often hailed as model minorities today, that they were the most intractable problem for US citizenship policy, right? And so whenever President Trump says this and that about China, Asian Americans kind of freak out, right? The other point is that the fate of Korean Americans is the fate of Asian Americans. And so, in other words, in the United States, we practice this racial juridical subject, right? We have white, yellow, black, brown, red, and there are no formal citizenship laws that ever distinguished or differentiated between these racial categories, right? So what's interesting is that all these Koreans coming to the United States who have such a sharp sense of difference between the Chinese, Koreans, and themselves find in America that they're treated all the same, including like the Filipinos and Indians. That's not part of the East Asian model. So that's an important lesson. And a man by the name of Emson Char is a Korean immigrant who served in the First World War. Let me say it again. He served in the First World War. And he was a war veteran. And on that basis, he was granted citizenship. even though Asians weren't allowed to be citizens. Very quickly, United States government found out that he is an Asian, and they sued to strip him of his citizenship. And they successfully did so in 1921, right? And he joins then a number of Asians, no less than 12, who brought petitions against the United States to argue, watch this phrase, that individual merit should trump group discrimination. But the Supreme Court says, no, group membership trumps individual merit.
Let's take Crenshaw Boulevard, I-10 East, Los Angeles. In 800 feet,
All right.
turn right on West 6th Street.
The photo here is Emson Char. So as soon as he is denied citizenship, his wife loses her ability to stay in the U.S. She was an independence worker activist. If she went back to Korea, surely the Japanese government would persecute her. So it actually took a legislation to have her stay in the U.S. There was a congressman who took sympathy on the Chars and granted her citizenship, or granted her permanent residency. They would go on to have 3 children, and Char became became a draftsman and died as a civil servant. The communities back in those days, what did Korean communities look like? They didn't look like Koreatown, Los Angeles. They were not urban. Most of the communities were rural because most of the Koreans were farmers, engaged in tenant farming. One of the big communities were in Ridley, California. A town so small that we see the sign of it when we drive up to San Francisco. But then we don't see it, right? It's just boom, and it's gone. Right? So Central Valley becomes an important point of Koreans. But many Koreans, after the Alien Land Act, can't farm because unless you could become a citizen, you can't own land, which means that many of them begin to filter into places like San Francisco and Los Angeles and make their living off of the ethnic economy. So like I said, it's not, the history of Koreans is really a kind of a sad but a very familiar chapter in American ethnic history. And America's great promise, where all people are treated equally and where individual rights triumph, was denied to Korean Americans in a very tragic way. The fate of Korean Americans will change with the civil rights victories that are won in the 1960s. So once again, it turns out that the fate of 8 Korean Americans are hitched to the fate of African Americans, Latinos. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, allow Korean Americans a fuller participation in education and economic opportunities. But the mother of all laws in the U.S. during this time, I think, is the Immigration Act of 1965, right? So coming at the Civil Rights Movement, when racial discrimination is being stamped out in various institutional parts of our life, one area where that happens is on immigration, right? And so the United States gets rid of the hated National Origins Act, which said that depending on the racial stock of any nation, we will set a quota of immigrants, right? So Great Britain will get a quota of like 40,000, but China will get a quota of 185, right? That sort of idea, right? All countries are allowed to send 20,000 quota immigrants, and if you have non-quota immigrants, children, wives, parents of U.S. citizens, they don't count against the quota, and so this is an era of mass migration. It turns out that Europeans did not want to come to the United States, and so why? Because the Marshall Plan, Europe's economy is doing really well. People are hopeful in Europe. The flow to the United States quickly stops. The biggest beneficiaries of the Immigration Act of 1965 are Asians and Latinos, right? Who will make up, at its height, 90% of all the beneficiaries of this new immigration policy. Things have changed a bit since then, and now there's growing sort of migration from Europe, but that's the idea. The 1965 Act re-emphasized two categories. One is family members, right? And that is by virtue of having a member of your family in the United States, they could sponsor you, you could immigrate. They had the priority, and the second group of people were people who came because of their occupational skills, right? The United States favored people who had highly educated, highly skilled individuals. People with modest skills, but if US economy needed them, like nurses. So doctors, engineers, and nurses account for like bulk of that occupational category. We had two rounds of immigration changes. So 65 Act is probably the most inclusive immigration law. The 1990 Act, coming after the Reagan administration, decided that the family reunification priority was allowing too many working class and poor immigrants to come. So the 1990 Act ensured that occupational category folks have big priority. In fact, that they would have like a floor. So every year, the occupational category would be well represented. The 1990 law also allowed this change, and this is a very important change that all of you guys are living with because you guys are school teachers and so on. It allowed people who are not immigrants to come to the United States and work on a temporary basis, or it allowed wealthy immigrants to come to the United States, and if they could invest $1 million, they could secure permanent residency. But as long as you're looking for investments, you could stick around. Bring your spouse and your children. It's a wild idea, but that's the policy we have, and it impacts Koreans in a profound way. So in other words, from 1965 to 1990, we have this kind of inclusive, family member-based immigration. Immigration would always be permanent, right? From 1990 now, we have emphasis on high-skilled workers, and big bulk of foreigners that are coming into the United States come on a temporary basis, right? And once their employment is up, they need to leave. All right. This is a fascinating graph. The darker line is the number of Koreans coming to the United States every year, right? And what we see is a big peak that in fact happens way back in the 80s. Man, that's like super long time ago. And the number just plummets. And people who study immigration, right, in the late 80s and 90s, thought it was over. We all thought like, oh, there's going to be no more immigration to the United States. But then it picked up. The consensus, well, the idea here is the reason why the numbers were so high was Korea was such a poor country. Okay? So all that stuff you've been learning about Korea, the GDP, per capita GDP, I'm not starting with the zero here. It means that in 1970, per capita GDP of South Korea was $617 a year, right? Korea was 4 times poorer than the Philippines and 8 times poorer than Mexico, right? And so people came during this time as a way to escape poverty, crushing, unrelenting poverty. But after the Olympics in South Korea, the Korean economy boomed and the number declined. So the idea here is that this kind of immigration that was driven up because of the poverty of Korea, that came to a stop. Well, what happened then? Well, what I would argue is that this shows our age of globalization, where people are immigrating not just because they're poor, but because they want to take strategic advantage of a globalizing world, right? And so this explains why we all of a sudden have so much European immigration. A lot of Europeans are thinking, like, oh, coming to the United States, securing education or work experience will be helpful now for them. And so all of that to say, we're in a kind of a interesting phase in immigration. All right. This is the population of Koreans in the United States. You see the rapid growth on the left hand. And then on the right hand is taking stock of the new immigrants that are coming in. And what you see is decline, rapid decline, but something of a recovery in the Korean immigration numbers. Right now, we have 1.6 million Korean Americans in the United States. If all Korean Americans went back to Korea, it would be the 5th largest city in South Korea. If all Koreans lived in just one city, we would make the 5th largest city in the US, right? It's a kind of an interesting thought experiment. Okay. Next is here in Los Angeles. Where do Koreans live? And once again, if you're a school teacher, if you're from Southern California, this should be kind of an interesting map for you, right? One idea is that Korean immigrants, because of their new arrival, because of all the pioneering immigration that was done earlier, are still clustered in Koreatown, here in Los Angeles, and Garden Grove in Orange County. So those of us who are familiar with Orange County understand that Garden Grove was like Koreatown here in LA. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, this is where Koreans gathered to create an ethnic enclave with the ethnic labor market, lots of restaurants and businesses that served the residents that were living in this area. Koreatown and Garden Grove, Koreatown, also had a very large concentration of like the garment industry, which was a economic activity that sustained the Koreans when they first arrived, right? However, the other communities, as they suburbanize, Koreans are not suburbanizing, number one, in a kind of an even way, right? Koreans are finding themselves out in the suburbs, right? If you're from New York, when I say Long Island, what do you think? Yeah, well, Italians and Jews assimilated and moved out, but hey man, they weren't going to go to rural Pennsylvania. You know what I'm saying? They're going to find each other, build delicatessens and synagogues, and so I don't want to hear any of this assimilation business, right? Because this is one of the longest patterns in American history. That is, the second and third generation search for each other. You gotta have drama in your life, and that's where you find it. All right. What's interesting about Korean suburbanization is that they're clustered around essentially good high schools, right? High-performing high schools. Cerritos. Many of you, I'm sure, know the names of high schools in Southern California that Koreans are concentrated in, right? And so that's a very unique element of Korean Americans. I don't want to overplay this, right? Because if you look at affluent Chinese, it's still the same way, right? Clustering around places like Arcadia, for instance, or Cupertino. They're searching for educational excellence, and they have the economic means to do so, right? That's obviously a very important point. But this is the geographic distribution of Koreans, and that is concentration in their ethnic enclaves plus concentration in these pockets of educational excellence. the pivot that I want to make now is to look at sort of two big issues within, contemporary Korean American community and make some remarks on that. The civil unrest in 1992 here in Los Angeles, I think in many ways signaled a profound pivot point for Korean Americans, and that is, before 1992, perhaps Korean Americans could think that they live in an ethnic island. Right? They live in an ethnic island. They're here, they're trying to secure a foothold, they're trying to make money, provide foundation for their future. And they prioritized the economic life. They didn't think about things like politics or race relations or how they fit or don't fit with the broader American society. If we think that might be the sense in the community, the 92 civil unrest blew that up. And it reminded Korean Americans that their destiny here in the United States is inextricably linked with the fate of other groups, right? And so that's that idea. And so what's happened since Saigu? Well, the civil unrest of 1992 is so important, Koreans gave it their own name, right? And Koreans give names to important historical events by their date. So 4/19, April 29th is how they remember this name, right? It's a transformational kind of moment. Since the civil unrest of 1992, I think, one big thing, I'm actually in LA Times today. There's a big homeless issue in Koreatown, and I got interviewed and then talk about a version of this. One thing is people like David Liu, who's a city council member, right? Who, when the 92 riots happened, he was an intern for Yvonne Goldwaith Burke, right? African American county supervisor. He was her assistant, running around LA, and now he's the city council member here in Los Angeles. So that epitomizes that idea that Asian Korean Americans must be boundary crossers and coalition builders. And I think David is our poster child for that. However, as you look around Koreatown, one of the things I'm frightened of is that we traded away our ethnic island for a transnational bubble, right? And it's kind of easy in Koreatown to think oh man, Koreans are more connected to Seoul than we are to Pico Union or South Los Angeles. I think it's a big temptation. The final slide has to do with, for school teachers, what are some of the things that you need to, what are some likely issues that Korean Americans come to you with? One is this idea that now Korean American students, if they were part of that peak immigration crowd, like myself, if they're children of that, they're second generation Korean Americans, and some of them even third generation, right? And so I know that you guys are just all hyped up about all this Korean stuff. You probably know more Korean stuff than some of your students who are generations removed from that, right? Now, also among second generation Korean Americans, significant percentage of them, about 40% of them are multi-ethnic, multiracial Korean Americans. It means being Korean means a little more complicated than that. Maybe I'll use myself an example. So my children are now in college. Both of them are in college. So they're, second generation. My wife is Japanese American, and so they're, half Japanese and half Korean. You can see how interesting conversations could happen, right? Some of my friends who come over, they sometimes, oh, whoops, no, right? Because if you assume that all Koreans hate the Japanese, mileage may vary a bit. is the point. Also, there are recent immigrants. The numbers have gone up, like I said, because of all the strategizing that people are doing across migration. And so, in the same classroom, you could have a multiracial, second-generation Korean American sitting next to a brand new Korean student who's an immigrant. And that student might be joined by the third group. These are what I call transnationals, and they are different from immigrants. They don't have a green card. They just have a temporary visa. And they're going to be at your classroom for 3 years, maybe in your school district for 6 years, but they will go back. Or there's nothing more permanent than temporary, but so that they might kind of stick around. But it's hard to say, right? And that is another big challenge. But across all these three groups, as my point about Sung Man Ri pointed out, Koreans bring very high academic expectations, right? And so for a lot of these transnationals, the parents might have gotten their graduate degrees in the United States at top-tier graduate schools. They want their children to have similar, if not outdo them, and so on, right? And so as a 1.5 generation myself, I immigrated at the age of 10 in 1975. My own parenting with my kids is fraught with these kinds of expectations, right? And so the kids always say stuff like, "Dad, I'm not an immigrant. Quit telling me to get all A's," stuff like that, which is source of endless fascination. And I know I'm doing that, but like I can't stop. I don't know. That's because it's so annoying. They're on the iPhone all the time, and they're like, "I got a B+," and I'm like, "If you weren't on the iPhone." Right? So it's been fun because when I got into this, I saw the world through the eyes of a child of an immigrant, and now I see the world through like a parent of an immigrant, but somebody who came so young, so early. I know the kind of socialization you're going through. So with all of that, you guys have a handful, and that is. With the Korean American students, you have this historical legacy and contemporary complexities. And so with that, I'll extend and say good luck. Thank you.